This video follows on from videos linked below on the economy is like an egg farm with us as the chickens, and perpetual population growth isn't natural, normal, or the future. And together with those videos explores the future in countries where governments with egg farm mentality are mistakenly making our lives worse in an attempt to try to continue national population growth through immigration even beyond the global population peak, in what will ultimately be a failed attempt to impose perpetual population growth on citizens who have already adopted a birth rate which would end population growth. Welcome to One Finite Planet video on National Egg Farm Thinking, seeking growth despite global population falling. While national governments generally acknowledge that the global population will peak, many still project their own population will defy that trend and continue perpetual growth, that local birth rates will no longer fall, and immigration could keep the national population increasing, progressively moving to being an increasing percentage of the world population. And it would take centuries before the world would run out of supply of migrants. Now, in 2025, for countries like the USA, Canada and Australia, this plan is almost universally accepted, partly because, as evidenced in the quote from Joe Biden, the economy is like an egg farm metrics result in population growth being seen as necessary economic policy, even by political parties across the spectrum. There's a combination of confirmation bias on the if more chickens is good for the farm, more chickens must also be good for the chickens, and a mistaken assumption everything will just continue as it is now. The same mistake which led in the 1970s to the assumption population growth would continue until catastrophic overpopulation, and now leads to assumptions we face catastrophic underpopulation. The belief is also fueled by repetitive messages of how countries where population growth is ending are heading for an economic catastrophe, suggestions that families having less children and an end to population growth is unnatural, together with calls for families to have more children to boost economic growth, and statements on how we need immigration because of the economic benefits. But the belief can't last. Population correction to provide a better future for children is not just something other countries are doing. It's happening because it makes sense given where humanity is right now, which is why people in the very countries looking to defy the global trend already have birth rates below replacement level. Governments take actions to try and correct those birth rates, but projects that simply pay have had very limited success in increasing births, mostly because, aside from some kind of Handmaid's Tale or baby factory scheme, to increase births nationwide would require payments sufficient to meet all the costs of housing, feeding and educating an extra child in order to prevent impact on living standards for any children already in the family.
There's a theory that you can do it through natalist policies. That is, you pay couples to have children. You increase benefits for paternity leave. You do all sorts of things that you can in order to encourage a couple to have that third child. This doesn't work.
We have seen most societies react like they're living in this world and throw money at people to have more babies, but it doesn't work. South Korea has spent $210 billion over the last 16 years trying to raise fertility, and they keep hitting record lows, under 1 child per woman on average.
And there's a need to specifically reduce the real cost of housing, as opposed to just pushing people into smaller and smaller homes or helping people increase their debt burden. There are, as explained later in this video, negative effects from just planning for perpetual growth, and those effects continue to suppress birth rates, cause increasing protest from citizens, and impact the only other path to resist the population trend, immigration. It can appear that in many countries, immigration levels are already sufficient to counter the effect of low birth rates. But the reality is the effect of low birth rates hasn't yet arrived, so there's nothing yet to be counted, as the effect is delayed by population momentum. See Wikipedia or content link below for more, but there are examples to follow which show how birth rates can take decades to impact population growth. And this, not immigration, is the main reason population growth has continued in those countries. Once the full effect of immigration rates take hold, current levels of immigration will no longer deliver growth and will become unsustainable. While accepting immigrants during this period of peak population, if done correctly, is humanitarian and appropriate, immigration for economic motives often ends up being immoral, comes at the expense of humanitarian immigration, and in the end can ensure birth rates continue to fall. While accepting immigrants in search of a new home is admirable, poaching skilled workers whose education was funded by poorer nations on the basis we can't possibly train all the doctors or engineers we need to grow our economy is not so admirable. Why is it that poor countries that often pay richer countries to educate their students can train even in excess of doctors and engineers?
Astronomers tell us that when we look to the night sky, we're actually looking back in time. Light from those faraway stars takes so long to reach our eyes here on Earth that by the time we wish upon a particular star, it may no longer even exist. I'm here to tell you the population of Earth is a lot like those stars. In parts of the globe, the human population is already or will soon be shrinking. I know what you're thinking, and yes, total population is still growing from 8 billion today to a peak of probably 9 or 10 billion. But when we track total increase, we're looking at this star that seems to be shining brightly, but in actuality has already imploded. And that's because there's a difference between what's happening on the surface, which is obvious total growth, and the tectonic forces beneath. Since the 1960s, world population has more than doubled, but the growth rate has been falling the entire time. We're witnessing the most fundamental shift to take place in modern human history, the shift towards pervasive and permanent low fertility, population aging, and eventual depopulation. Fertility is down everywhere, just at different rates in different places.
As discussed, populations can continue growing in defiance of birth rates because, for example, in 2025, the population of people reaching an average life expectancy of 80 years reflects the smaller population born around 80 years ago in 1945, when population was smaller and growth was still accelerating. This population momentum results from the first phase of an end to growth, increasing the ageing population effect as the ratio of younger people decreases. Note that, contrary to the propaganda, as covered in content link below, an ageing population doesn't mean a lower ratio of workers unless children also count as workers, or at least count from a younger age than the reality of modern society. These population pyramids show the change in the USA from 1965, when 0 to 5-year-olds outnumbered 65 to 70-year-olds by over 3 to 1, to 2025, where the ratio is now 0.9 to 1. Note that even with these population pyramids, any data on the future always seems to assume this is the end of falling birth rates, because that's the official position for most countries. This makes future projections almost always an overestimate, and births and deaths being in balance usually arrives sooner than countries predict, as with China in 2022. Immigration aside, population falls when deaths exceed births. While the UK reached this point in 2023, and yes, earlier than expected, both the USA and Australia, despite having birth rates below replacement level for decades, even without immigration, would in 2025 still experience population growth because of the delayed effect of population momentum. The official projections are for this to finally end in the 2030s, but these are official projections which need adjusting every year, and even ChatGPT predicts will occur in both countries before 2030. So population momentum will end births alone driving population growth before 2030, and move towards a population decline of around 1% per year, most likely at least until housing affordability recovers. As is happening now in the UK, for the first few years after births fall below deaths, the amount of natural decrease slowly builds each year and can take nearly another decade to fully reverse the impact of current levels of immigration. Plus, several countries recorded peak levels of immigration post-COVID, with Australia and Canada having had 1 to 2 years of record high immigration rates that boosted population growth by 2% and above, creating economic growth for the farm at times when living standards for the chickens were falling, and enough to counter trends even after population momentum. In both countries, all major political parties have committed to restore their historically more typical immigration levels, and those typical levels would see Australia and Canada join all other developed nations in having immigration that won't continue to counter birth rates. But could some countries take the example of Australia and Canada provided for that brief period post-COVID, but on an extended time frame, and run very high-level immigration levels for decades? Well, turns out no. Understanding why requires first another look at global population. Global population is projected to continue for anywhere between another 25 and another 60 years, which is a huge range. Why such variation? Well, the very political UN projects the longest time, which includes the assumption shown here. And, as discussed in content linked below, is based on coincidence theories discussed in the birthrates chapter, which correlate for only a short period in the past, have failed to predict outcomes from 2000, and continually to fail in predicting the future. Note that the UN projections, being based on those assumptions, have resulted in their projections being brought forward by around 2 years, every 2 years, for over 10 years. It's not just their latest two projections, shown here, but as illustrated by this article from 2013, with Deutsche Bank at that time predicting 2055, when the UN was projecting the date would be after 2100. Now, the current UN projection is for a date 16 years earlier than they projected just 12 years ago, meaning it's changed 28 years in 12 years. If that trend continues, it would result in a date even before 2055, which I feel is more realistic. But then, even in 2013, that looked more realistic. Realistic or not, we're stuck with the UN currently predicting population growth until 2084, although since peak child occurred at around 140 million births in 2017, and births per year since then are gradually declining, all population growth from now will be increases in progressively older age groups, and in around 30 years will be restricted to only those over around 50.
And later decades of the century. We also think that migration itself is will in the midterm be coming to an end. Canada used to bring a lot of people from China. Now not so much. China is reaching developed world status. It has an aging population. There's not a tremendous, the Chinese don't feel a tremendous need to come to Canada. India is now at replacement rate. We may find over time that there'll be less desire on the part of Indians to leave India to come to Canada. Philippines, as I said, is urbanizing. Its fertility rate is falling. So we may find, in a couple of decades where you actually have to go and beat the bushes to get people to come to your country.
And even India, as it seems to be this bright star assuming the throne as world's most populous country, has below replacement fertility. The number of young people entering into India's workforce has already peaked.
Sub-Saharan Africa, which is sort of the one place left on Earth where there are still very high fertility rates, though those fertility rates too are going down.
As population growth rates in regions around the world decline, potential sources of immigration have shifted from Europe to Latin America and Asia. But now, with Latin America and Asia, other than Afghanistan and Pakistan, now having birth rates comparable, and in some rates even lower than in most countries that use immigration to boost population, the source of immigrants will need to increasingly switch to Afghanistan, Pakistan and Africa. And even on the not credible UN projections, by 2050, the main candidates for immigration will be people from Africa over the age of 50. Nothing against that group, but unless they have babies in the new country, they won't actually sustain population growth. If the data continues to match the children get priority rather than coincidence theories, immigration will stop providing population growth anywhere by 2050. To some extent, it's more important that people understand that growth will stop than exactly when it will stop. Okay, so the good news is governments will ultimately fail in their current misguided pursuit of perpetual population growth. So we're not on track to a future dystopia living like battery hens. The bad news is we have the problem that economists still have governments convinced to plan on indefinite population growth in order to grow the egg farm. And it's the promoting of that plan that is the current problem, as the planning of growth exacerbates the three problems from the introduction: the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, and the rise of the far right. As Golding said, nothing physical can grow indefinitely, which means, and for anyone failing to consider that population is also physical, they'll believe all physical assets will perpetually increase in scarcity. If population perpetually grows, the scarcity of assets will be perpetually increasing the wealth of those who own assets as investments beyond the assets they own for their own use. Asset values rise not only because of current scarcity, but also in anticipation of future scarcity, which means governments projecting perpetual growth leads to those listening to those projections believing real estate will perpetually increase in value, inflating the current value. This also creates hoarding, with those who can stocking up like with toilet paper when a pandemic is announced, bringing forward housing shortages and delaying the release of land as soon as having much greater value, if held back now, to be released in the future. Housing, for those who listen, becomes primarily an investment rather than being a place for people to live. That investment in housing becomes a bubble with values inflated by a false belief that housing will perpetually increase in scarcity as society heads towards a caged hens dystopian future. While, ironically, this creates barriers to population growth because housing becomes overpriced, it's still good for the economy because increasing asset values can allow consumers to borrow more, enabling increased spending even without real incomes increasing. Another potential source of housing shortages is that some large-scale investors will use research and see reports such as from Deutsche Bank warning that future population won't grow as governments plan and fear a bubble, holding off on development of long-term additional housing until after that bubble bursts. The bubble could deflate slowly as more people realise early, as locations with $1 housing are starting to increase, or burst because everyone realises all at once prior to any deflating. As discussed in content to be linked below on When the Bubble Bursts, the bubble bursting or deflating will benefit most people, as most people own either an amount of housing equivalent to their own needs or less, but would erode the wealth of farm owners and those with the most wealth. So, in the meantime, expect politicians to focus on how to assist people spend an ever higher percentage of their income on housing or own less, but to do as little as possible to actually reduce the price of housing. Population growth increases the scarcity of everything finite, which usually increases the price of everything physical, and thus all goods, and even services that pay rent or make use of finite resources. As with real estate, the effect on prices is magnified by expectations of future scarcity. Even the impact of a falsely inflated real estate bubble alone can significantly raise the cost of living, as only online businesses with no physical presence have any ability to avoid raising prices to cover the increasing costs of real estate. Any business with a retail presence faces the threat their location becoming more valuable for housing. Burst the population will grow in perpetuity bubble, and the cost of living also falls. While reducing the cost of living is good for consumers, anytime prices are reduced, economic activity and GDP fall and can cause deflation, which gives governments even more reasons to avoid bursting the bubble. I suggest the true story is that humanity is facing a crest of peak population, following growth that overshot the ideal, while correcting for the population explosion side effect of near elimination of the horror of high child mortality, which plagued humanity throughout history. We'll soon be over that crest, Our own population and global pressures driving high immigration will ease and birth rates can stabilise. But until things settle, many nations are dealing with all but those with extreme wealth facing unnecessarily high housing and living costs, fearing that perpetually high immigration, combined with birth rates of their children, would mean descendants of the current population would become insignificant in their own country, with dystopian explanations like, "This is the consequence of educating women, but don't worry, the economy will still grow as we can more than replace the reduction in population with immigrants from other countries." Is it really that surprising that a message of perpetual population growth through immigration leads to an increasing number of people calling for an end to immigration? Sure, economic activity can build more man-made spaces for people, but for natural places, like the beach or parks, there's nothing that can be done to prevent them being too crowded, other than restricting access to a privileged few. Then there is that we live on a planet where the total amount of life is not increasing, meaning more of us means less of other life. For decades, governments, both left and right of centre, have applied egg farm thinking and used immigration as a tool to grow the farm and boost economic growth. For left ideology, the economics allow for being more accepting of immigrants, and the right accepts immigration provided it benefits the economy. Both sides manage to keep big business and wealthy donors happy by adding to the pool of consumers. But in the end, birth rates don't lie, and the same increasing scarcities that drive birth rates low also lead to increasing pressure from voters to end population growth from other sources, such as immigration. The fact that governments continue to obscure the reality that the population growth is ending must surely make immigration even less welcome than if people are aware that growth was ending. There is increasing recognition population growth has become problematic. And while the response is erratic and confused by disinformation on future population, it is happening on both sides of politics. For example, in Denmark, hardly an intolerant country, the left has introduced hardline immigration laws. And in the UK, things have reached the point where centre-left Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK wrote in a May 2025 policy paper, "The damage immigration has done to our country is incalculable." Clearly, using immigration to continue population growth creates pushback. And worryingly, many with racist, xenophobic, and extreme right views push back. Maybe some, such as Keir Starmer has attempted, can listen and channel the pushback to find more positive solutions, but it's hard to see a solution without acknowledging, while it can continue for a short time, population growth is going to end. Trump will have an impact. While to my knowledge not publicly endorsing zero population growth, Donald Trump could even achieve negative US population growth during this current term, down from growth of 7.3 million in his first term, or 7.1 million under Biden. As can be seen from the table, population change can be expressed as the sum of three categories. The first category, unauthorised migration, will be down under Trump, and is targeted to drop from between 2 to 3 million under Biden to not just back to the net zero of the previous Trump term, but to minus 10 million, with the targeted deportation of 10 million unauthorised residents. If between government and self-deportations, Trump actually manages a 2 million reduction of unauthorised residents during this term, that minus 2 million would likely be enough to ensure zero or even negative total growth over the Trump term. The second category, natural population change, is falling naturally as population momentum is gradually overcome. It was down to 500,000 in 2024 and is expected to come close to zero by 2028 and be around 1 million for the entire presidential 4-year term. Natural population change was not much higher during Biden's term at 1.7 million, in part due to COVID, but was 4.4 million in Trump's first term and has averaged over 5.5 million in each of the terms of Obama and Bush. This means a record low population growth around 75% below any of this century, even if the third category, authorised migration, is unchanged. But reduction in this category too seems highly likely, as authorised arrivals have also been deported, and combined with the situation for foreign students, some potential authorised arrivals may feel less welcome. Note, authorised migration is normally less than half of the authorised arrivals because people also leave the USA, either because their study or work time came to an end, or because even US citizens sometimes decide to reside elsewhere, which means any significant change in arrivals can make the migration number also go negative. The reality is, if the end of population growth has not already arrived in the US, then it's very, very close. For the USA, the impact will be mixed. It could alleviate housing shortages and reduce business costs, improve consumer and voter sentiment, and while the effect on economic metrics of the stock market and GDP should be negative, it may not show, as both numbers are so dominated by global tech stocks. The real test will be, can the US achieve near zero population growth while avoiding economic disaster? Of course, Trump is doing so many other things that are likely to attract either the blame or the credit for what happens in the US over Trump's term, but near zero population growth in the USA is highly likely to force a rethink on economic metrics for the US and globally. Watch this space. Nigel Farage, current leader of the UK Reform Party, has been a political figure in the UK since the 1990s, but rose to international prominence for pushback against immigration as leader of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, and as leader of the Brexit Party during the UK Brexit Leave campaign, and is now again the leader of that party, although it's been renamed to Reform UK Party. Farage has called for UK to give net zero a new meaning, calling for net zero immigration apart from essential immigration until 2030. Okay, problematic and unrealistic in the form put by Farage, as it calls for the UK to stop all net immigration at the time the world population still has significant growth, at the same time businesses complain they can't get enough staff, and ignores that once population momentum is overcome, immigration need no longer increase population. But Farage has said, if we can get into people's minds that we have to try and stop this relentless rise in population, and that having a negative impact, that's where you start. And on that, I suggest he's right. However, like net zero and CO2 emissions, getting there immediately could be impractical. With population growth, the biggest step is establishing agreement on, in Farage's words, getting it into people's minds that we have to stop. And my suggestion is modifying net zero to, as with emissions, be by 2050, could achieve getting into people's minds without the pain of sudden change. Extra time to allow population momentum to be overcome in developed nations would mean the target could be met by 2050 without any reduction in immigration rates. It just requires being honest with the population and allowing the concept to get into people's minds. Why would anyone, well, apart from some billionaires and real estate moguls, complain? The good news is our children and their children don't need to fear a dystopian future of spiralling housing costs that would, if continued, make housing unaffordable for the average person, cause an ever-increasing cost of living, and advance rising xenophobia fueling the far right. Bad news is the myth of perpetual population growth, as promoted by many governments around the world, is creating exactly that disillusioning picture of the future, and may even be increasing suicide rates. This is the problem of metrics that treat the economy like an egg farm. It results in even well-meaning politicians believing that indefinite population growth will not only always be good for large political donors, it will also be good for the chickens. The suggestion is, while it won't solve every future problem, promoting how net zero population growth by 2050 could reduce these problems and allow a more measured approach rather than panic pushbacks on immigration. There is hope this view can at least reduce negative views of the future and show even those already with a positive outlook an even more positive outlook. Please, if you care for young people, spread the word that population growth is ending in all nations and not collapsing because of catastrophe, but ending because remaining free range is the best path to future prosperity for all.